After the Tea Party, the work begins. And I think we can safely say, with the new protests down in New York City, that the Tea Party movement in its public form, if it's not already dead because of what we're going to start to see with the onset of violence and disruptions equivalent to the 60s, it probably should be greatly avoided. And I say this as a Tea Party person. So just to clarify, I know in the bulletin a while ago we had some good warnings about public demonstrations, so on and so forth, and how they can get manipulated. And understanding the perspective of the John Birch Society, you can understand how this can happen. So with that caveat, let's move forward. Just to give you a little bit of my qualifications. The Metro Land is the equivalent free rag publication that you would see in your local town, the one with the provocative advertisements in the back, so on and so forth. Well, the Metro Land took a liking to the Tea Party movement, expecting to find the typical stereotypes and to be able to exploit those stereotypes and publish about them. And I actually met a reporter we worked with pretty closely at one of these raucous town halls that were an early feature of the Tea Party movement in 2009, the summer of 2009. And when I spoke with the gentleman, he said, you know, I was at the Republican National Convention in 2008, and the best access I got to anybody were the people in the Ron Paul movement, and I actually interviewed Jack McManus. And he found it very accessible. So with that groundwork, we've set up a pretty good relationship to be able to get some earned media and a little bit of balance. But from a left-wing paper, this is the sort of balance you get. You know, this is, of course, they use the derogatory teabagger. Best teabagger of 2010 for the Capital District, Kevin McCashion. Yeah, he might be the driving force behind much of what the Republican Tea Party crowd is up to in the Capital Region, but we got to admit it. We like this guy. We wish his sincere curiosity and intelligence were hallmarks of his movement, and then here come the stereotypes, and not crazy racist ranting. Sure, he is a conspiracy nut and loves him some John Birch Society, but show us a liberal activist without some kooky ideas, okay? We were at the Tea Party rally held in Albany and listened as he educated the crowd on the illnesses in the Republican Party. It certainly wasn't a crowd-pleasing speech, but it took guts, brains, and honesty, and that's what we look for in an ideological opponent. Now, as you and I know, there are many ills in the so-called Republican Tea Party, and we're the first to point them out in the John Birch Society. And so the closer the Tea Party and Tea Party activists, as we'll discuss in the Albany area, get to the John Birch Society, the more hope there is for them to become fully educated and, in the main around here, to become John Birch Society members. So, if I knew what I know now going in, there was a great speech by Robert Welch back in the 60s. There's no easy way. And the quote from it was, "Please keep always in mind, my friends, that there is no easy way." Now, what does that refer to? I know you mostly know this speech by heart. It refers to the fact that in creating an informed electorate, it's done person by person, in living rooms, house to house, neighbor to neighbor. In other words, there is no easy way. And what happens in the initial phase of the Tea Party movement was there's a whole amalgam of different organizations. And when I started, I only sort of got onto the conspiracy in the summer of 2008. And by the fall, I said, boy, I have to become an activist. This is serious. And the way I sort of woke up was through the internet. And as you know, there's a lot of garbage on the internet. But the internet wakes people up. And it's only in the interaction with local people and local activists, can there be the proper education? And so the first meeting I went to was actually Campaign for Liberty. And in Campaign for Liberty, this was in early 2009, and then the first Tea Parties start in April of 2009. We were on a schedule where we met weekly, and we had action items because we had people who were financial consultants and in business management positions, and I'm a business owner, and they weren't about to waste their time. They were hardcore activists, or they became that way, but their education had to be brought along. And so what we would see is all sorts of different groups. And in No Easy Way, Robert Welch's, it's a seminal speech. He talks in a particular section about taxes and tactics. In other words, there are many organizations that are involved with tax protest, tax strike. And back in the 1960s, the John Birch Society had it figured out. It doesn't work. And so what happens is a lot of Tea Party groups and Tea Party affiliated groups and groups in the Liberty Movement spin their wheels and waste their time and go down these different tangents, as Robert Welch called it. Different tangents and diversions and false conspiracies and information put out by the conspiracy to undermine your understanding of the conspiracy. So this is where we were. And so in a very hectic April, which featured Tea Party in Albany and the Fed rallies in New York City, on April 19th, I went out to Lexington Green, Lexington and Concord, and there was a joint event with Sheriff Mack and Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers. It was the sort of inaugural Oath Keepers event. And there was a gentleman out there, and I said, boy, that guy in his suit and trench coat, he looks like he's with the FBI. And I placed it away in my head and had a good day and went home and went to they had a little reception after and met all the good people. And then I think I went to a John Birch Society public meeting. There was one in April, right around the same time. It was probably Jack McManus about defeating the New World Order. And later on, a month later, somebody came to my shop, a small business owner. Man walks into my shop. Oh boy, it's the man from the FBI. Who is this guy? Well, he introduces himself and he says, I'm Hal Shurtleff, regional coordinator for the John Birch Society. And the first thing he says, I said, well, yeah, what's the John Birch Society? What's the John Birch Society? And he says, well, let me put it this way. People used to ask the FBI about the John Birch Society, and now they ask the John Birch Society about the FBI. I was close. I was close. So there we are. And before I was a member of the John Birch Society and had a little bit better understanding of the civil rights era, protests, demonstrations, and how they can get out of control, pressure from below, pressure from above, we had these ridiculous town halls. And so everybody, as new activists, is fired up, and they're out there sign waving and protesting and doing what they think is right because they're new and they have new energy, and I was included. So one of the seminal moments was when we had a healthcare town hall with our local Congressman Tonko, and I don't think it was one of our members or a Bircher who put "Communists love Tonko" up there, but it expressed the sentiment. Oh, it was one of our people. There you go. Well, it was definitely unapproved. But I took a softer tack, and I decided on a phrase that the activists would have fun with, and I picked up 100 pairs of Groucho Marx glasses. And people made signs and we made shirts that we were grouchy about Marxism. And we were grouchy about the Marxist tendencies and the direction we were heading. Well, as we get further into the conspiracy and we realize, unlike our leftist friends say, ideological opponents, we know it's good versus evil, and it can't be minimized. But new people have to be given some lenience, some understanding that they still need to learn. But regardless, this energy, this Tea Party energy, what's it all about, and where's it headed? Well, where it was headed for us was tactics that we understood to get somebody who was an able spokesperson or could turn a quick phrase in front of the media. And while, you wouldn't exactly represent the John Birch Society in a Groucho Marx set of glasses in front of a camera, Appleton wouldn't like that, and we would never do that. We would, however, get people involved with the highest traffic newspapers in the Capital District. And so we had a Tea Party movement blog on the Times-Union, which is owned by Hearst, ironically. We know Hearst's role in the conspiracy. And there's the Troy Record, and another blog over on the Troy Record. Well, what sort of content can you get out there to help people understand? Well, here we have from the 4th of July 2010, Thomas Jefferson, conspiracy theorist. And we know he said, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, right? The Declaration of Independence. The initial conspiracy, understanding. So, as you can see, or maybe you can't, from that, just 1 week on the Times-Union's website would bring 1,600 first-time visitors and an average of 5,800 page loads. So it's a much larger microphone, and a lot of it, even though it's liberal media, they were interested, and they are interested in hearing this different perspective, largely because it's unpaid. So we work for free, and they get their clicks, and they get their advertising, and they get their revenue. But it's a way to get the word out. Here we have another protest and a rally, and a lot of it was promoted and assisted and helped by our local talk radio host. Now, this guy holding the Gadsden flag with the fun noodle. Now, explain the fun noodle was because the state of New York, when you have protests, won't let you have sticks. So a flag on a fun noodle is appropriate or inappropriate, as we'll see. So Al Roney was and is a great friend of the John Birch Society in the sense that when we have local speakers, and Albany is well-renowned for having very large crowds and a very efficient process that they follow to get large audiences which bring in new members. Remember, speeches aren't for the members, they're for the prospects. And anytime we have someone in town, Mr. McManus or any other speaker, we'll get them on the radio. And so we have good friends in the media because we're reasonable and we can explain things and we understand how to explain what we understand. And so that's where self-education comes in. You're only as good an activist as you are a person who understands the conspiracy and the fight that we're in. And of course, Al Roney got fired, coincidentally, right after I did a live interview with him from CPAC in 2010, and I was on air, and he's on a Clear Channel station, and he's on air, and he said, well, who's down there? And I said, well, Mitt Romney's speaking, and I think I saw where they plugged the USB into his back. The man's a robot. And so the next day, Al Roney's let go by Clear Channel, and he says, Kev, did you know that Clear Channel Communications has a very large owner in Bain Capital? And Bain Capital, of course, has a very large owner in Mitt Romney. But it was just a joke. He actually was let go and Glenn Beck took over. But Roney was surfaced or placed on the only local talk radio station left that's not sort of neocon radio during the day. You know, this is the only local topic. And he's 100% on our side. And he's still a great friend. And so he was there for the rallies in 2009. Well, back to the grouchy about Marxism. So after I became a member of the John Birch Society and looked into the health care issue, the health insurance issue, so valuable resources presented by my section leader and other valuable assets that say, hey, these guys, John Birch Society, had this stuff figured out a long time ago, in the 50s and 60s. And here we have Gary Handy's Medicine Leads the Way. That's a reprint from the 70s. And Bad Medicine, Socialist Medical Care is Bad Medical Care. And obviously the classic speech by Robert Welch, Medicine Leads the Way. So here's all these great educational assets that I forgot to mention that I'm also an alumni of College of the Holy Cross, where Mr. McManus went, and I was a history major. So two things appeal to me about the John Birch Society. First, as a business owner and a franchise owner, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I want to be part of an organization, and this is what I saw from the Tea Party, that has a plan and has a program, and this is what we offer. And second, I love history. I was a history major. And granted, when I was in college, it was Francis Fukuyama and the neocon track to the State Department. That was the history they were offering. They weren't Marxists, but they were definitely on the other side. I guess they're Trotskyites if they're neocons. But that's the main appeal. And so we see in, obviously, the classic, the Blue Book, how do we focus our activism? Who do we target? Well, all the answers are in the Blue Book. But the one ultimately sure way of achieving this reversal is to awaken enough local leaders among an apathetic American people before the continuous brainwashing by the left make it impossible, to the point of generating public pressures that will force the slowdown and reversal. At the present time, so this is 58 at least, at the present time, it is far more important for us to try to reverse the direction of the molding of opinions of men who read and think and study are themselves opinion molders than it is for us to beat our brains out in too hurried and too ambitious a direct attack on a massive wall, that being mass opinion, that we cannot budge. So our focus in the John Birch Society in the Albany area, and it was something I noticed early on, and another reason why I joined was because everybody in every organization locally also was a member in the John Birch Society, or the majority was, and definitely the leadership. So up here, in the capital of New York, this big empire state, very collectivist, legacy to Nelson Rockefeller, everybody who has been an activist in the majority, by far the majority of the Tea Party activists, joined the John Birch Society. And this is the remnant that we'll see moving forward because it's been so effective and it'll continue to be effective if we follow the program. So that being said, also from the Blue Book, some of our local actions go under different banners. And the use of ad hoc committees was commented on. The organized fronts, little fronts, big fronts, temporary fronts, permanent fronts, all kinds of fronts. One of the greatest weaknesses and mistakes on the conservative side has been that almost all of the organizations, real ones or just letterhead outfits, or we should say web page outfits now, have been put together for general purposes. The most effective fronts on either side are ad hoc committees aimed to accomplish, or at least to publicize, one particular purpose. So how have we used these committees in the Capital District and in a couple cases nationally? Well, the first is a nod to earlier organizations that some members belong to, not official program at all of the John Birch Society, but were the very effective trim bulletins. And so the trim bulletins is a very simple scorecard, report card. How did your representative vote? Average cost per household. Did the vote move for lower taxes and less government, or higher taxes and big government? And then obviously the scorecard based on the Constitution. Well, what we decided to do up here was to create a little door hanger. And the door hanger says, "Do not disturb my life, liberty, and property." And on the back, it refers to the famous Thomas Jefferson quote, "We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty a profusion and servitude." And so we targeted 3 votes, put it on a door hanger for Congressman to the north, Scott Murphy, a Democrat. And we would do it, and we're going to do it for the Republican congressman who succeeded him. And so we took our activists and we went out and we went door to door and we put the door hangers out on a Saturday, nice sunny Saturday. Great activity. And so the Daily Kos, who has a few bloggers who are former reporters for the same papers that we have blogs on, said, hey, these guys, the teabaggers, always with the derogatory comments, the local teabaggers will have more impact in New York 20 than Dick Morris's obscure D.C. outfit because they will be talking to and identifying voters in the New York 20 starting tomorrow. Local organizer Kevin McCashion put out a call to everyone, and they covered our call to action. And so constantly, throughout all of our activities locally, we would have the Daily Kos, national website, focusing and commenting and trying to understand, how can these guys get 3,000 people out? What's wrong with us? Why can't we have our, socialist revolution? And so I tended to be the target, willing target. We had a lot of fun with it. And it says, Kevin McCashion is a whirling dervish of wingnut activity. He's a die-hard Paul Bircher type who's a member leader of various local teabagger groups, and then, 6 or 7 groups, and somehow I'm in charge of all of them. Very busy. He holds weekly educational meetings with required readings and is a several times a day contributor to local teabagger message boards. And so the quickest way to thin out your groups and to get to the best people is to require reading. That's a constant. So we would get a lot of coverage. And we would get coverage in the press, and the local newspapers would call up for quotes and to try to find out what we were up to next. But after this quick activity, this quick weekend walk through a few neighborhoods in this congressman's district, we got what I call the wind-up and the pitch. By Monday, they had a letter out to all their contributors and the people on our email list too. And so this ex-congressman, Scott Murphy, X to B, says things just got more outrageous over the weekend. Last week, I was called a traitor to the American people who sold out my country. It wasn't us, somebody else did. But this past weekend, members of the ultra-conservative Birch Society, a group that actually opposed the Civil Rights Act, went door to door to my neighbors handing out flyers that lied about my voting record. And of course, where did we get the voting record? The Freedom Index. So we know it's not a lie. What's more, the group listed on the flyer as the source for these lies is a front organization with a fake website on this flyer. In the last week, we've had an outpouring of support for our fight to show that our message of change and hope can overcome the lies and fear-mongering that leads to the use of words like treason. With the March 31st fundraising deadline only 56 hours away, it's time to fight back. Yada, yada, yada. So as soon as I got a copy of that fundraising letter, I turned around to my email list and I emailed it out to raise funds. And it's effective. And then we said, well, we got to figure out a way to step it up. You can't exactly go door to door. And so by working with other organizations who were willing to go on point, in this case, Campaign for Liberty, we set up a congressional report card. Basically the same fundamentals as TRIM. And we garnered donations. And so, of course, you're not going to target all 200,000 voters. That'd be foolish. But we understand, and this turkey gets a constitutional grade of an F, voting for the bailouts and food safety, the quote-unquote food safety bill and quote-unquote Wall Street reform and Obamacare and voting against auditing the Fed. So this turkey gets an F, and it's in big red letters. And so what happened was we took and we targeted the swing voters. And so in order to do that, you have to understand how to get to the Board of Elections and go through and find somebody who can do quick databases for you and sort stuff. It's not that difficult. And you definitely have any resources you can always find. We always find artists and printers and techie people and computer people. And so we sent out about 10,000 of these congressional report cards. In this district, there could be one. In the Albany area, there's the other congressman that communists love so much, according to the sign. This guy is the product of a 100-year-old Democratic machine, and the mayor of Albany was around longer than the Daley administration, 42 years. So we focus on what's achievable. And so what happened was Murphy lost. And so another guy with a bow tie, liberal columnist from the Daily Gazette, the Schenectady newspaper, says in a little comment after the election, this little piece ex officio, of all the attack ads that came at me this season, one in particular stood out, both because I received it on Election Day itself, which was impressive timing, and because of its singular deceptiveness. It came from, quote, my congressional report card, which I had never heard of before, and which called itself a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots organization. And it attacked Scott Murphy. It was in the form of a school report card listing Murphy's votes on 6 particular bills dear to the hearts of the right, those being cap and trade, as they call pollution control, the stimulus bill, food safety, Wall Street reform, healthcare reform, and audit the Fed. Murphy was given a big red X on his votes on each of those, with the explanation that green checks are constitutional, red X are unconstitutional. Not just unwise or undesirable, but unconstitutional. Says who? Says, it turns out, Ron Paul. Though he is not identified as the power behind this allegedly nonpartisan grassroots organization, which is a project of his Campaign for Liberty. But that's who it is, as a Google search quickly establishes. Ron Paul, quack politician, self-elevated to the role of Supreme Court Justice ex officio, smearing a Democrat on behalf of the Tea Partying Chris Gibson, so his opponent, his Republican opponent, and hiding behind the disclaimer that the smear is, quote, not meant as an endorsement of any candidate. I begin to see what they mean when they disparage democracy. They make me want to disparage it too. Ooh, harsh words that immediately get sent out to the mailing list as a fundraiser. But who was this Chris Gibson that we were purportedly working on behalf of? Well, Chris Gibson parachuted in from probably about 5 tours overseas as the pick of the establishment, the Republican establishment in New York State. And he was, at the beginning of the year, a colonel in the 82nd Airborne. And while we respect and honor military service, there was something more to Mr. Gibson's record besides he's a decorated, with Purple Heart and Bronze Stars, wounded in action in Iraq. But Mr. Gibson was a fellow at the Hoover Institute before he ran for Congress. And so we sent out a little warning letter, open letter to Colonel Kilgore. Now, we don't need another neocon, was the basic message. And that some gentlemen associated with the Hoover Institute trend in that direction nowadays. And so here is, the warning. Let's hear some of those. This was in response to an editorial by him. Let's hear some of those ideas other than those espoused by the big government Keynesians of the left and right. Ask your friend Victor Davis Hanson, another Hoover Institute gentleman, how well the Roman Empire was able to pay off the invading tribes when they wouldn't accept their debased currency anymore. Endless empire leads to economic collapse, while the continued bread and circuses for all are not sustainable. You may think you're seeing the return of King Jerry Solomon. So this was this former congressman that they modeled him after. The same people that put Jerry Solomon into power years ago put Chris Gibson in the driver's seat. So you may think we are seeing the return of King Jerry Solomon, but it was Solomon's own policies and unwillingness to adapt that put Solomon's temple and empire in ruins. So nowadays, anybody in public office tends to have some sort of an internet scraper or search, a Google alert, so to speak. And so anytime their name is mentioned, they'll get an alert. So it's particularly effective to write anything about your congressman on the internet because they're going to see it. And so within a day or so, here we are that we're supposed to be some front organization or working for Chris Gibson or working for the Republicans according to the left. Here we have an attack on the Republicans' candidate. And so I get an email. Hey, man, you don't even know me. It was from Chris Gibson. Why don't we get together and have lunch? So immediately, this candidate who was largely inaccessible became accessible because of his concern. The association with the Tea Party movement at that point in time was nobody knows the strength, nobody knows the numbers, but they seem to have been effective. And obviously, the same group that maybe is associated with putting out these report cards is obviously going to put out report cards when he's in office. And so I met and had lunch with the congressman-to-be, and I said, man, there's a lot you got to learn. And he says, I wrote a book on securing the state. It was on a Madisonian approach to the national security state when I was at Hoover. And I said, well, good, then you're familiar with the Constitution. I said, this is good. It'll be a good relationship. He's a true constitutionalist. So what do you feel about your service in all these undeclared wars? Well, man. Well, that's something to think about. He's learning. He's a politician. That's something to think about. But regardless, Congressman Gibson, Chris Gibson, has been very accessible. And for a guy who, sort of the joke is that we say he parachuted in to the district, he's had some good votes. And when I was down at CPAC the other year, they were just getting into the Patriot Act renewal. And so here's these freshman congressmen. And let's see how well these quote-unquote, and he wasn't really a Tea Party congressman, although some of the members of Tea Party groups certainly supported him, people who haven't totally come along in their education. And a lot of that has to do with access to power. And it's something that everyone needs to remember, and certainly new activists definitely need to understand that there's a difference when a congressman has lunch with you, or a congressman responds to you, or talks with you, or knows your name. That's having access to power. That's not the same as being able to influence their vote. And so you always have to step back and think, what am I trading if I have a relationship with a politician? And then you always have to think, when they tell you something about the way the world works, or how the vote went down, or what D.C. is all about, you immediately say to yourself, how does the politician gain if I believe this? And how does it benefit them if I believe why they voted no and why it was the necessary thing to do? So we've had good conversations, and And one of the better moments was when I was down at CPAC, and they had the Patriot Act renewal vote. And so here's a guy who, came out strong. He's in Iraq, decorated, wounded. I'm sure he's seen men killed. And he says, I got to vote against this Patriot Act because it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so I said, that's really good. And so I talked to Gibson and I said, you're learning. And he said, man, that's not right. It's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. It's clear as day. And he says, so I'm sitting down on the floor, and there's Ron Paul. And he says, so I go over to Ron and I say, hey, Ron, I'm going to vote against this procedural vote. I can't support this violation of the Fourth Amendment in any way whatsoever. And Dr. Paul turns up to him and says, oh, they're not going to like you if you do that. But he did. And even, the second closest congressman to Congressman Paul, Justin Amash, or Justin Amash, however you pronounce it, Gibson's in with that crowd. Now, does he stray? Yeah, he strays, so we still have a lot of work to do. He voted to continue NPR funding. He made the wrong choice on the NLRB legislation that just passed. But on civil liberties, as a former colonel who served in Iraq, he's going in the right direction. So, as a consequence of my relationship with him, Gibson and his entire staff are on my email. And I have all their personal emails. So every article or every action, because I don't believe in hiding what we're doing. Everything's done in daylight. And so every action he knows. And so, how do you get him to understand this stuff? Well, as you can see, he was a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Who else do we know who's been associated with our understanding who's a fellow at the Hoover Institution? Anthony Sutton says, Gibson, here's another Hoover guy. Would you be interested in reading some good stuff from another Hoover Institute fellow? Sure, I will. So that's how he proceeds in his understanding. But the Tea Party as a whole, and for our activists, benefit, and this is an important sort of call to action, is that there's so many discontinued books that are short. The entire Americanist library, they're brief, they've essentially highlighted years ago, decades ago, the issues that we're facing now. And every Tea Party member benefits from it. And so when I had another Tea Party organization, we would have required readings. And everybody from Garrett Garrett to John T. Flynn, or to understand even how the media works with Obama, Gary Allen's Jimmy Carter, short read, indispensable. And, and it would apply to Herman Cain or anything you're seeing now, any of this foolishness. So those are invaluable resources that would be great if they were available easily on an iPad or a Kindle, because our activists still read, and they need those resources as much as possible, and there's no reason they should go anywhere else to get them. So, what else have we been up to? Well, at CPAC, local activists, unaffiliated with the John Birch Society, worked up some literature about Mitt Romney. Do we really need another progressive in the White House? And so this little piece of literature, we have a load of 5,000 and 10,000 going to New Hampshire right now for activists that we've met and networked with, boots on the ground in New Hampshire, to help educate as they go door to door to primary voters. And so the effective action comes from targeting those people who actually vote. And effective action with congressmen and influencing, you want to influence the influence voters, you want to get a hold of their donor list. Who donates money to these congressmen? Well, Well, those people would benefit from a subscription to the New American Magazine. They would benefit from getting a Freedom Index in the mail because they're activists themselves. They step up with money. And so they got to understand and be able to apply pressure on the congressman. Here's somebody else who the John Birch Society materials have decimated his career, thank God, and it's a great job. So, were a guy like Newt Gingrich to appear at an event like CPAC, and were there to be hundreds of these DVDs floating around about the real Newt Gingrich, it could be bad. Or were there to be some old speeches given in the Albany area, put on a CD and handed out, and were they to get in the hands of 3,000 or 5,000 activists at CPAC, that would be bad news for the conspiracy, because the people that attend CPAC are influence molders. And all these things will probably continue in the future. Now, since you're all in New York, you can all get married to whoever you want. Ah, there we go, right? So you should take advantage of that. Well, how does a Birch understanding and education help these Tea Party activists and help ourselves to know what's going on here? Well, quote-unquote marriage equality, gay marriage, passed recently in New York State. And just like if you read old Alan Stang, or you hear old Alan Stang presentations, they would have, excerpts from the New York Times, or even Arts Updates have excerpts from the Wall Street Journal. They let you know what's going on. And so here we see, how did gay marriage get passed in New York State, a heavily Democratic state? Well, they didn't control the Senate. Well, who was in control of the Senate? The Republicans were. Well, how did they influence them? Well, Cuomo sat down with hedge fund owners, and so these hedge fund owners ponied up $6 million that were sent to, as donations, to targeted Republican state senators. And so they also would target state senators who had relatives who were homosexuals and lean on them and say, this is what you got to do. You got to get this through. Well, if you didn't really have an understanding of conspiracies and how they work and how an activist minority achieves things, you would just say, well, those dirty Democrats, or, oh, some Republican traitors. And so with having read books like Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, you have this paradigm where you'll know that, here's Wall Street money getting getting by and influencing social issues in New York State, and it's happening in our time. It's not just something abstract, from 1917. And so finally, and why I put that warning in the beginning about the Tea Party, and I would say that the Tea Party movement is smartened up, and they've become more engaged. They are reading. And so we see the next big issue and the next big influx of John Birch Society members is going to be associated with Agenda 21 and national speaker tours of Agenda 21, because it's getting a lot of big play in the mainline neocon media. And so there's opportunity there. And obviously Bill Jasper and the Society have been on top of their game. And the Society's been on top of the UN since day one. And it's all associated. But I put up this slide because, once again, here we see, this is a bulletin from December of 1963. And the foreword has the quote, "What's past is prologue." And here's these invaluable Birch resources. And one of the 63 bulletins gets into this other picture. It's a famous picture of an attack dog from the civil rights era. And we're one to look at that and you say, boy, this is a terrible situation. And currently, when you look at the other picture, this is the other day from this quote-unquote Occupy Wall Street, where it gets violent. And so the pictures you see on the news are what? policemen, NYPD, swinging batons. Unprovoked, right? Just like the attack dog, unprovoked. But were you alive in the 60s, and were you a John Birch Society member, you would have heard the story about how the police were lined up with attack dogs, and one of the so-called nonviolent activists walked over and kicked the dog. And the dog, of course, responded in kind. But the picture that was published was of an attack dog attacking these so-called nonviolent pacifist protesters. And so this is the warning going forward, is that people have to learn fast. And they are coming to that understanding quickly that public demonstrations aren't the way to go. And it's never been recommended by the John Birch Society, for sure. But in the incipient days of the Tea Party movement, that's where the activists were to be found. And so as we drive into the neighborhoods and we work our 110-6 programs, all these brilliant things that were franchised years ago, figured out, we want to tap back into the historical resources of the society to have understanding, because what's past is prologue. And as always, education is our total strategy, and truth is our only weapon. Thank you.